So consider, for example, doctors urge wider colon tests. Right? Speaking with some knowledge, I know that colon tests are quite wide enough. Thank you. Right? But those meanings, when we see it in the newspaper, we know what they're trying to communicate. So we don't have any trouble resolving the ambiguousness in the language and going with the meaning that we know to be true. Another one, Jane Fonda to teens, use head to avoid pregnancy. Now, there are some things that we know will appear in newspapers and other things we know will not appear in newspapers, at least not in this form. So all of that understanding we have about what it is that information and how it gets communicated helps us to make sense of that. We impose that understanding very quickly and very easily. So all of those processes contribute to helping us to understand what it is we're looking at, but they also are not infallible. They don't represent the information in the world as it is. They represent it in order to serve our interests. And sometimes those interests are at odds with the information that is coming into us from an everyday environment. Now, this is a powerful illusion. Ed Adelson is a faculty member at MIT. And what I will insist to you as you look at his checkerboard is that the squares labeled A and B are exactly the same shade of gray, the squares themselves. Now, does anyone see them as exactly the same shade of gray? No. Does anyone believe me that they, in fact, are the same shade of gray? Okay, a few people that have seen it before. But otherwise, you probably wouldn't, right? Well, let me try to prove it to you. So I will first just grab, I have those two squares, and I'm not going to do any new PowerPoint 2007 tricks. I'm just going to drag it right off the side of the page, and it will appear that I'm changing the color of the squares. But I'm not. Right. Now, that is remarkable. That And you may still think, well, that's because he's lying, and he is actually lying. But it is, in fact, the case that they are the same shade of gray. So I'll show you another variation, which is to connect them. Now, as soon as they're connected by a common shade of gray, our mind makes a very different inference about what it is that we're seeing, right? It's no longer a couple of different squares all over a full checkerboard. Now there is a single object that A and B are part of. And so because our mind says, oh, this is one object, it makes sense of it as, oh, well, and the color is the same shade. The color, in fact, implies something about it being the same object here, whereas the fact that it's the same color here does not imply they're the same object because there's other distinctions in the scene that we use to make sense of it. And the reason that this particular illusion works is because it takes advantage of a couple of things that our mind does perceptually. One is that we care a lot about edges. Edges tell us a lot about when one thing ends and another thing begins. And in order to distinguish the various objects in our everyday environment, we need to know how to separate those objects perceptually. And so A is surrounded by light squares, B is surrounded by dark squares. So A is adjusted in our minds as lighter than it is, or darker than it is, excuse me, and B is adjusted as lighter because to distinguish it from the surround, right? The other thing is we know a lot about shade. Those of us who grew up on Earth and had just a single sun are very accustomed to the fact that shade is around. And shade does not actually change the color of things underneath it. It just provides an obscuring view, so we don't see those colors as vividly. So we also have mental adjustments based on the shade provided by that particular image. But knowing all of that, having the knowledge of all of these things influencing our perception does not change the perception itself. You can stare at this, and I've tried, for a very, very long time, and you will still see A and B as different shades of gray. You can't change it by sheer force of will because it is the inference that our mind imposes based on previous experience, history, the utility of drawing these distinctions for us to make it simple so that we don't have to use cognitive resources, waste the time thinking about all of these bits and pieces of information. We just understand the scene. And the scene is, it's a checkerboard with this circular cylinder thing on top of it. Okay. Ideology, in this sense, is the sense maker for us. We have tons of events, of beliefs, of claims that we are constantly considering every day. The information that we're accumulating based on our trying to understand our social lives is too complicated to consider in all its bits and pieces. So we need ways of organizing it. We need structure to impose on it, order to help us understand what it is that we're seeing and we're thinking and we're doing. And that is the purpose that ideology serves. It provides that organizational framework to help us make sense of all of those bits and pieces of information we get every day. Now, the risk is that as soon as we impose a structure and order, it becomes much harder to see the exceptions. It gets much harder to see which bits and pieces of information aren't consistent. And then it becomes a crutch. So we use the structure that we have imposed and then start to ignore all of the other pieces of information that are coming up that would teach us something new, give us a new way to think about that particular problem. And so ideology has at its base a way of maintaining itself because it has a structure that is easy to maintain, that's easy to think about, and doesn't require the cognitive complexity of questioning, of doubting, of wondering if what I'm thinking now is or is not the right way to think about it. I don't remember what my next slide is, so let's see. Okay, so an example of that comes from Jeff Cohen's work, and he may say more about this when he speaks later today. And we have done some follow-up things related to what he has done. So in his original paradigm, there is an article that shows a debate over welfare policy. There's two different proposals. One is a generous plan, another one is stringent. And Democrats support one and Republicans support the other. Now, making an experiment, Jeff did a simple manipulation. He altered, randomized, which one the Republicans and the Democrats supported. And then he asked people who were liberal and conservative, which plan do you support? And why is it that you support that? And what he found is that not just that ideology did have some influence on which plan we support. People who are liberal were more likely to support the generous plan. People who are conservative more likely to support the stringent one. But also, just the fact that one was labeled with a little R as Republican endorsed it, or a D, Democrat endorsed it, also had an effect, sometimes even a stronger effect in certain circumstances than the actual content of the proposal itself. Labeling it as a Democrat or Republican proposal shaped the interpretation, shaped the understanding of what that information must mean. And so liberals, when they're looking at it and it's supported by a Republican, had more suspicions, more doubts, and did not want to support that plan, and still claimed that it was based on a reasoned analysis of the proposal itself. I support this other one because it has other things that I think are important. So that simplifying set of, well, if a Democrat says it, then I like it, Republican says it, I don't, or vice versa, provides an easy way to make sense of that information. So one of the tasks of social scientists is to investigate, to identify those factors that vary across individuals that provide that interpretation frame. What are the things that differentiate liberals from conservatives or religious ideologues from atheists? What are the things that they think about? What are the mental processes that make those interpretive frames change and alter their perception of what presumably are the same events? Mazarine mentioned some of this already, and there will be many other factors that are raised, I assume, as the day goes on. John Jost's meta-analytic review with Jack and Aryeh and Frank Sulloway identified two major factors that differentiate liberals and conservatives from their review. One is a general resistance to change, so conservatives more likely to accept the status quo, be worried about ambiguity, and as a function of the uncertainties that change produce, whereas liberals were more amenable to change, more likely to, even though they have some discomfort with uncertainty as well, more likely to take that chance instead of upending the current status. And then Mazarine talked a lot about the second factor, an acceptance of inequality, that the world is either inevitably hierarchical or that we can strive to be a communal bath or whatever it is that liberals believe.